The battle for ideas is the pulse of any healthy democracy. Thought leadership, policy debates, and building institutions that deepen democracy and encourage critical thinking has, of course, always been important. In the era of COVID-19, even more so. Joining me to unpack this and the role of think tanks is the Executive Director of MISTRA, Joel Netitenze, and, of course, his colleague, Dr. Abba Omar. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me here on The Fix. You celebrating your 10th anniversary. You have done remarkable work in terms of policy development, also looking at South Africa's place in the world of nations, 26 or so years into democracy. Joel, let me start with you. If we look at the global pandemic that we face now, what exactly is it that think tanks need to do differently to ensure things like critical debate and, of course, that battle for ideas, particularly as government looms large to make decisions on behalf of citizens in a way that could rob them of freedoms enshrined in the Constitution?
Thank you, Karima. It's a wide area, but briefly one can talk about two categories of think tanks. In the first instance, in the context of the current pandemic, we have those think tanks or research institutes like the MRC, which are dealing with the pathology as well as the epidemiology of the pandemic. And you also have institutions like the CSIR, which is dealing with ICT and spatial issues. And you also have the Human Sciences Research Council, which has done a variety of surveys. Where would MISTRA fit in this context? The fundamental questions that inspired the formation of MISTRA were: why do nations succeed and how do civilizations sustain themselves? And in that context, we have published about 21 books on comprehensive issues relating to the political economy, relating to humanities and social sciences as well as natural sciences. But in relation to the pandemic in particular, last year we published a book on epidemics and the health of African nations, and there are many, many lessons that derive from that research. Fundamental to that is what the researchers call the syndemics approach to the handling of epidemics and pandemics. Amongst the immediate questions that arise in relation to COVID-19 at the global level would be, we've got dazzling scientific achievements on a global scale, ICT, robotics, and so on. But why is it that insufficient resources have been allocated to research on pandemics of this nature? But secondly, the fundamental question of the balance in politics between the state, the citizen, and the market, and the role of the state. Many had seen the state as an irritant, but this pandemic has demonstrated very, very clearly that states are very, very fundamental to the survival of global humanity, to the survival of nation states. I can come to South Africa if there is time in that regard to say one of the fundamental issues is that to succeed in dealing with pandemics, you need two currencies. The first one is legitimacy and trust, and the second one is the capacity of the state to be able to implement its policy.
All right, Joe, hold that thought. Let me bring Abba in here. We have to do this as a discussion and as a dialogue. In terms of the two last points that Joel has just raised, the capacity of the state and the question of trust, if you look at the way in which President Cyril Ramaphosa's administration has been dealing with COVID-19 so far and the attendant, dissatisfaction, we've got the leader of the opposition party, John Steenhuisen, taking the government to court. We've got some scientists who sit in those institutions that are guiding government this morning in the Sunday Times, suggesting that government's decisions are not based on any rational approach. How would you assess, Abba, the way in which government has handled this situation in terms of those two issues that Joel has raised?
Thank you, Karima. Like the rest of South Africa, I'm sure I could happily go on listening to Joel, so I don't mind him continuing. But I think the question that you're raising is a fundamental question, and it's a kind of question that even think tanks have been wondering about. And recently, the authors of How Nations Fail came out with a book titled The Narrow Corridor. Basically, it talks about the balance that any state needs to find between liberty and the state itself. And if we don't find that balance right, it goes in one direction or the other. Now, in a moment of crisis like this, I think our starting point should be the welfare of everybody. We have to put the people at the center. We have to look at, I think, as the president says, lives and livelihoods. We need to look at how the state continues, how the economy continues, and most importantly, how the nation itself comes together. So I think there would be concerns at a level, about a matter of detail, the level of consultation. I personally believe that we could have a lot more explaining, as you saw when you were interviewing Minister Patel this morning, that we need a lot more clarity about what's happening. Society has every right to expect that of the state and of its public representatives.
Now, Joel, let me bring you in here. Let's do the issue on a global scale. We have a president in the United States, Donald Trump, who some critics have said question the very basis of epistemology, how we arrive at facts. He has been, widely slated for his approach and the lack of appreciation for science, and we've seen nations that have historically kind of led at the level of the battle of ideas fall behind because they are not able to introduce a new template and reimagine a world in which we have to live with the reality of COVID-19. How do think tanks place epistemology back in the center when you have such powerful political actors such as Donald Trump? You've got Bolsonaro in Brazil and other figures in Hungary, where people literally have no respect for science. They are hugely popular and they wield enormous power. How do think tanks enable societies and citizens to take that power back and to put facts, on the table again?
I think with regard to the two examples that you have given of strange conduct that does not seem to be helping in the discourse on COVID-19, the saying that crises bring out the best and the worst in human beings, I think is playing itself out very clearly. But if there is any, perhaps a good thing that we can take out of this, is that if you were to look at Brazil, I think the second health minister has resigned precisely because they are trying to put forward rational approaches to this pandemic. With regard to the United States, you can see how the various scientists who are in the formal structures of government are trying all the time to direct discourse towards matters to do with science. But if there was one major concern personally that I have, especially with regard to the United States, it is that in the discourse that is happening going forward in relation to the elections, there might be a tendency on the part of both parties to compete on the basis of who is strongest in their negative approach towards China. Unfortunately, in a situation in which especially these two big powers need to cooperate, both at the level of science, in dealing with matters of the economy, as well as with regard to issues to do with trade, so that all of us, including African countries, can work together to ensure that we are able to deal with what is a black swan event, an event that humanity has never experienced.
Absolutely, and of course geopolitics are playing a massive role just in the way in which we are dealing with this question. Let's take a short break. When we return, we continue our conversation on the role of think tanks in developing critical thinking, particularly in the era of COVID-19. Stay tuned.